I am here in one piece. I will preface my talk today by telling you that I left Washington, D.C. at 3 o'clock this morning. And that will make the headband demonstration that much more interesting when we get to it. So cut me a little slack if I start sounding loopy up here on stage. I am Amy Webb. I'm the head of Webb Media Group. We're a digital strategy agency. We look at near, future, emerging technologies, many of which I'm going to show you today. And we advise our clients on how to build their audience, how to get people engaged, how to revolutionize their business strategies, and the like. We work with a lot of different types of organizations. Media companies are about half of our portfolio. The rest are other kinds of organizations like American Express. This is my 7th annual Tech Trends talk, so it's neat. Yeah, thank you for coming every year. Thank you. Testify, thank you. And it's so nice that everybody has a seat and doesn't have to be in the cheap seats behind me. Because those of you who had to do that a couple years ago know what happens to me when I'm speaking on stage. Anyhow, I just wanted to say thank you for coming back again and again. So I'm going to show you 10 trends today. These are by no means comprehensive. They're things that I think that you and your news organizations will be interested in and things you should be aware of. I'm tracking hundreds of trends at any given time, so I just wanted to make that sort of clear in advance. So these are things that you should be paying attention to in the next 12 months, so between now and the end of 2015. Also, there's a lot of text. Don't worry about this, because you'll download the presentation later. But I've color-coded things this year, so you'll see red tags at the bottom of some of the slides, yellow and green. Anything in green means that I'm highly confident that what I'm showing you will actually happen, will take off, will have a meaningful impact. Things that are in yellow are things that I'm still sort of looking at, but I feel very confident that these will happen. Anything that you see in red, I'm very intrigued by, and it could go either way. So let's get started with wearables. So it turns out that as excited as everybody is about Google Glass, a guy named Steve Mann, years ago, started experimenting with different kinds of cameras over his eyes. In fact, he got in a lot of trouble in a McDonald's once because he was taking photos of McDonald's folks, and at that point, the word glass hole wasn't a term of art among us. And so they weren't quite sure what this thing was or why he was wearing it and taking photos. He's been experimenting for a long time with not just taking photos in this way, but augmented reality. And really, that's what he does. So he's been researching two-directional calendars and ways to both receive and then project back out information in real time. So, Google Glass, which we're all pretty excited about, and, watches, which we're all pretty excited about, they're just some of the many, many, many wearables that I'm currently tracking. This is one called Cuff, one of what I'm estimating to be less than 3% of the total wearables market that was actually designed with women in mind. This is jewelry, and it's intended for safety. So these are activity trackers. You can wear necklaces and cuffs, so like bracelets, and your family members and loved ones can track where you are. This is a lactic acid tracker sleeve for your calf. I am not somebody who runs, so I'm sure those of you who do think that this is going to be awesome. For me, it just looks really uncomfortable. But this actually tracks the lactic activity in your body, so it helps you know when you can sprint more and do the things that runners do that are totally alien to me. Speaking of exercise being alien to me, this is a shirt designed to help track your various biological responses while you're exercising, so your oxygen intake, your heart rate, your temperature, and the like. And this is a prototype from Fujitsu that is a glove that you wear, and the glove can be used to scan and interact with NFC, which is near-field communication, devices in order to project images for gesture control and to input and output information in real time. And then, of course, watches. Just by show of hands, how many people in the room have some kind of smartwatch either on or in the mail at some point? Maybe you were like me, waiting for your Pebble for like 15 years before it showed up, but got all those updates. Yes, we did. So the point is, in case you haven't already gathered, I'm actually tracking 253 devices. We hear a lot about the Pebble and about the iWatch, or just the watch, right? No more I in front of it. But in reality, this is a really, really big ecosystem, which has everybody, especially journalists, really excited. You probably, if not read, at least heard about the idea of glance journalism. There was a great story in the Neiman Journalism Lab that was talking about, maybe we're going to start publishing for glances, right? And the idea with that is, I've got a little screen here, I've got a little screen here or here or here, and I'm going to see news stories in sort of bite-sized glance format that allows me to interpret what's happening and then do something with that information, which I'm assuming that pretty soon you're going to be having meetings, glance optimized headlines, right? It's going to be the next big thing. I think it's premature. So I think in the coming year, we're going to start seeing more of the 253 wearables that I started to describe come into the marketplace and become more mainstream. But at the moment, these devices are not intended for content production. They are pretty much intended for content interpretation, so biometric reporting, and as a mobile second screen, which is something we don't talk too much about. In the next 3 years, based on the research that we have, I think that will change. Devices will have more cross-functionality, they'll have more penetration, and we'll see more average people starting to use these devices. And by that point, I think content may be a real possibility. Now, you may be wondering why I have this thing on my head. And I've definitely heard people more than once ask me what the hell I'm thinking. And now, you will get to see in real time, literally, what I am thinking. So if the awesome AV guys, really awesome in this room, can switch me over, they've been incredible. You have no idea what it was like to set all this up. Time to switch. There we go. So now I'm going to play a game, but what I want you to do is to watch functioning on like 4 hours of sleep. So there we go. I've got no brain waves. Okay, let's play. Come on, don't crash on me now. Well, the big, here we go. Oh, that's why, because I never know how to play this game is the problem. Here, hang on a second. I think this thing turned itself off. So anyhow, this is a Melon, and I'm going to show you my brain. There we go. It's going to be all over the place. I should have paid attention to it there. I'm looking for the one that's different. Anyhow, what this is doing, besides reminding me that every one of these is wrong, is it's tracking my EEG activity. And the idea is that if you wear this type of device, a lot of the devices that are out are meant for athletes, and I'm a big believer in training our mental acuity as much as we do our physical acuity. And you can actually see my brain in real time working here. And so if you participate with this over and over again, I can't believe I'm actually doing this, there we go. You will, over time, in theory, have some great data to use and take back. I've messed up right there. But anyhow, you get the idea, all right? And so this is called the Melon. You can go ahead and switch this. I'll keep talking and you can watch my brain moving. So this is called the Melon. And it was founded by two people, one of whom is a woman. And the idea is that, it's important to do mental training too. So this helps people who wear it understand when their brain activity, and you can see as I'm searching for words, the lines get a little bit more. Help people understand when they're focusing the best, when they're not focusing, when they could be working, when they could be doing things better, that sort of thing. So this is called the Melon. It's going to be on the market later on in the year. It's a prototype, so if you want to take a look at this and test your own mental acuity, by all means, afterwards, come on up and have a go with it. So we can switch back to my computer. So key takeaway here is to experiment with wearables. So if you haven't had a chance, definitely experiment. They can transmit information at the moment. Just bear in mind that these are not quite ready for content. And if anybody in the room is a hacker or a maker, I would love to start seeing some wearable devices that are intended for women, because we like this stuff too, and we buy stuff. So yes, tweet that. Just one thing. So every one of these trends is going to end in a just one thing that I want you to go back and do. And that just one thing is to, if you don't have your own wearable device, borrow somebody's and think about content. I think the more that you wear these things and the more that you think about content and your job, the more that you'll start to gain some clarity around what can and can't be done and what should and shouldn't be done for the moment. All right, our second trend has to do with behaviors and devices. Now, I was just at the ASNE conference talking about audience, I think that what I talked about there is important enough that it bears repeating here, so I'm going to talk about some of those same things next. And that has to do with how journalists perceive audience. So if you'll notice, I've got the device at the center of the ecosystem with a lot of thoughts coming into it. So is it a connected TV? Is it a tablet? Is it a Roku? Is it a wearable device? Is it something, right? And a lot of the decisions tend to get made not on the user's behaviors while they are using that device, but on the device itself. And the newsroom ecosystem focus, for the most part, has to do with getting the content to the device in a format that's not all wonky looking and screwed up. We've done a study looking at how journalists and non-journalists think about user behaviors, and this is certainly not to say that you're not thinking about user behaviors. I know that you are. But we see the reaction a little differently outside of journalism. Outside of journalism, the consumer and her user behavior and her actions while she's using her device tends to be more of a central focus than the device itself. And if you start thinking about it that way, right, suddenly that ecosystem looks quite different because you're now taking into account her activities. Is she walking? Is she running? Is she jogging? Is she sitting at a computer? Is she talking on the phone? Does she have multiple screens going at once? What are her motivations? And therefore, how should we send our content to her in a way that makes sense? So systems, tools, partners, they're all interconnected and they're all vital components of the ecosystem. And so for them, it's really about getting the content or the device out based on behavior versus device. And we see this happening in a lot of organizations that have become sort of hybrid media organizations. So Amazon, we think of as sort of this ubiquitous place where we can buy stuff and also, buy books, and maybe now they're starting to produce some video content. In reality, Amazon is a sort of platform that puts behavior at its center, at its core. And if you think about the telephone, right, which was just 100 years ago starting to come to market, the telephone was a pretty awesome invention. Really, really, at the time, it revolutionized things. It was so interesting. But its value became greater the more people that used that device, that bought a telephone, connected it, right? The greater number of telephones there were, the greater value was to everybody. And that's what we call network effect, which is a term that I know you sort of already know. The question is, can we have a network effect for news, right? Right now, news organizations produce content. And as a result of that, you are the product, right? That you being the news organization, the content is the product. On social networks, like Facebook, users are the product because we're being leveraged in order to make money. In the platform space, like Uber and Amazon and Apple, those are platforms that both generate value for themselves but help others generate value, which is then fed back into that company as well. It's a totally different way of thinking about audience, about engaging them, because audience now suddenly means lots of different things besides just the end user. So the question is, how do we start to define network effect within the realm of news? How can we start to think of news as a platform? So in the coming year, we're looking a lot at platform economics and what that means just in general, because there's a whole bunch of Uber of, right, Airbnb of, coming to market in the next year, and I'm really curious to think through what this means for journalism. If Amazon and Apple, if they're platform businesses with insatiable audiences that seemingly grow all the time, and the value is being created by the third parties, that presents some really great opportunities for everybody. So the key takeaway here is journalism is increasingly incompatible with our devices. We've started to see some companies, Circa is one of them, that are changing the way that they're creating and delivering news, but ultimately, journalism doesn't work with the devices that we have. But it works really well with people. People value journalism. So the question is, how can we start creating experiences that mirror how much people value what you're doing versus just producing content for the device itself? So for just one thing, this is a really easy thing that all of you can do, on your way back, assuming you can never get out of Chicago because the airport's closed down again. You could do a self-audit. So pick any 5 stories a day and do this for a week and interact with them in different environments. And not just when you're sitting at your desk or when you're commuting to work, But if you have 2 minutes online at a Starbucks, or you're in the bathroom, or you're doing whatever, pull out your device, whatever it may be, and interact with the same 5 stories. And over time, over that week, start to really think about your experience using this device and how your experience could be better. And I would do that not just for your own news stories, but for the networks that you use. So do the same thing with Twitter, and do the same thing with Facebook, and start to see if you see some connective tissue and teachings that you can take back. The third trend is algorithmic curation for publishing. So what I mean by algorithmic curation is a process that's automated. So basically, what content should be displayed or hidden, how should it be presented to the audience, that sort of thing. If you think about news content decisions in newsrooms, and again, I realize that this may be greatly summarizing some of the detailed conversations that happen, but a lot of times the conversations have to do with, is this going to be a longer treatment or a shorter treatment? Are we going to push this out to mobile first? Are we going to, is this going to be an interactive with multiple parts? And sort of that's how the conversation goes. When in reality, what you publish is what your audience sees, whether or not that's the experience that you intended them to have. And again, this goes back to what I was just saying. The device, therefore, is more important than the consumer and what she's doing at that moment in time. And the question that I have is, what are the other cases, or what are the other dimensions of storytelling? Well, if you think sort of the consumer again in the middle, and all of the possible activities she may be doing, because very few people sit down at their desk with the intent to read the newspaper, even if that is online, or the intent to sit down at their desk or at home and just watch CNN, right? This is not how we behave anymore. You have to think through, what are all the other possible things that might be happening at this moment, right? So if I'm a consumer, right now, if I have my phone on, you have the ability to know if I'm stationary or if I'm walking, right? Because you can harness the gyro and the accelerometer in my phone, which means that if I'm going 60 miles an hour, maybe don't deliver me a story that I'm going to have to read because I might be driving. Or if I'm going above a certain, like 120 miles an hour, it's most likely that I'm kind of not a great driver. Hopefully, right, we're not driving at that speed, which intimates that I'm probably on a train or I'm on an airplane. Or if I'm going 12 miles an hour, I'm probably not driving. Maybe, I don't know, you probably can't run 12 miles an hour. 4 miles an hour. Then I'm probably on my feet and I'm walking. These are things that your news organization has the ability to know. This is information you can get. And if you think through the implications of this, this means that you could create a single story and algorithmically curate that story for the user based on what she's doing at that moment in time. So rather than giving me a mobile version, I would get a jogging version, right? And maybe that jogging version is not text, but instead it's a 60-second read-through with a weird-sounding computer voice, but maybe that's something I'm going to respond to, bookmark it, and pick up and read it later on. Right? These are things that you have the ability to do if you're not thinking about the device, but you're thinking about user behavior instead. So we have this matrix that we apply when we're looking at new news applications especially, and this is what it looks like. So we're sort of scaling things, again, with the user in the center, around time, activities, behaviors, and what we call IQ or EQ, and I'll walk you through this. In terms of time or temporal activities, so are you creating content for a consumer at a particular moment in time, given that there are n number of variables, right? Lots of different potential things that person might be doing. And you can track this stuff. Do I tend to interact with, I can tell you right now that at about 11, ish, between 11 and 11:30 or so at night, I'm on BuzzFeed quizzes. Now you and my husband know this. Because I have bad insomnia, and the quizzes help me to get to sleep. But BuzzFeed could know this about me, right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Now you all do, so I guess BuzzFeed does. In terms of activities, you can develop content based on the consumer's activities at that moment in time, which I just described. Behaviors, so given my past behaviors, can you use my past behaviors as a predictive model for how I might engage further with the content that you're producing, which is another thing that you can track without too much difficulty. And finally, IQ and EQ. A lot of people are reading content, especially now, because they want to get smarter faster. And that can mean a wide variety of things. Maybe they're going into a board meeting and they want to be up on the latest company news for whichever company they're talking to. Or maybe they're going on a first date and they want to have like 5 or 6 clever anecdotes or crazy things that they just heard so that they have some conversation topics. If you define smart broadly, ultimately that's what a lot of people are coming for quick single servings of content for, right? So is there a way that you can leverage that behavior and engage consumers in some way? So I want to show you a company that I think does this pretty well. They literally just launched. It's called Reverb. And Reverb looks at a few things. It looks at my social behavior, so it uses my Twitter feed. It also looks at sort of a big segment of people and what they're looking at any given time. And then it looks at my predictive behaviors, so it's looking at the content that I'm clicking on most often and what I tend to engage with. And this is the result of that. So you can see that first screen showed you topics at that moment that were very popular. I'm going in now and I'm looking at stories on the Chicago Tribune. I am localizing, so that little dot, which is a little hard to see, down on the left-hand side, localize that content for wherever I'm at. These are the topics that I, at the moment that I was looking at this, that I was clicking on a lot. So I was looking at a lot of neuroscience stories and keeping track of what was happening in Syria. And for some reason, my social network, again, at this moment in time, was looking at pajama stories a lot. So I don't know if I was missing something. I think this was during Fashion Week. So again, this is something that helps me get smarter faster for a couple of reasons. One, as averse as we all are to tag clouds, because they're lame, right? We know they're lame. It's actually a really, really good way to engage me, even for a fraction of a second, to give me a quick snippet of this is what the world is thinking about. This is what my social network is thinking about. And these are the things that would be of interest to me that are important right now. So in that case, a word cloud actually helps a lot. And as I scroll through, I can get deeper and deeper into stories. So if I were to plot this against our sort of matrix, the time element, because this is so new, they haven't rolled that out as a feature, but the other things actually work pretty well. The user interface shows exactly the right amount of content on the screen for that screen size and what I'm doing with it. It aggregates content based on who I'm interacting with, and it's tracking my behavior. And it definitely makes me feel smarter faster. So if I were to plot this against the matrix, I would sort of, if the ideal position is dead in the middle, I would sort of put this over to the side a little bit because it's not tracking the time element so much, but I think that they'll be doing that pretty soon. I talk about Nuzzle a lot. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. For those of you who don't know what this, I'm going to first show you what it is if you haven't seen it, and then I'm going to show you some stuff that nobody's seen yet. But Nuzzle is an incredible app that I can't say enough about. And basically what it does is it scours my social network in a similar way. Once stories have reached a critical mass, so once enough people have shared a story, it bubbles up. And I've set the threshold, and I change the threshold based on how busy I am. So if I'm having a really, really busy day, I've got a high threshold, and I won't see stories and notifications of those stories until, like Magic Andrew, who I saw sitting over there at some point, until he shared something, and then the whole planet pays attention, because what Andrew finds is great, right? And if it's a slow day, I'll set the threshold much lower, and I'll have a lot more stories bubbling up. I've configured my social networks, and there's a really, really, really great story written on Medium by Erin Kassane, which you should all read, about why she's quitting Twitter and how she's using Twitter in a new way. I've configured Twitter, and I've got some different accounts so that it really just follows thought leaders, people who share stuff that I know are going to be great. And if I combine that highly curated network with this, suddenly I have a front page that's incredibly meaningful to me, and I would say that this is my sort of front page. This is my front page of the internet. There's some other really interesting design elements. So there were little heads that you would see attached to each story. I recognize those avatars immediately. So if I start to see certain heads on a story, I will immediately click and read that because I trust the people who have shared it. And then it's very configurable. You can set all different kinds of parameters to use it. Now, to be sure, filters restrict things, right? And we've all read the filter bubble, and we know that filtering sometimes is not super great, but we have to balance that against the fact that there's a lot of content and a limited amount of time to consume that content. So if I'm allowing algorithmic curation to help lead me through the day, and I'm still exposing myself to other things, I can be much more informed, much more productive. Now, what does this mean for you? You should start thinking through how to curate news in a more meaningful way for your consumers. And this does not mean launching topics pages every time there's a breaking news event and allowing them to go there. And this is also not personalization, the way that we've been talking about personalization for many years. This is something quite sophisticated, a different way of thinking. And so if you were to do just one thing, download these apps that I talked about and play with them yourselves, and then print out the matrix and plot your news app using the same parameters that I just discussed against that matrix to see where you fall. Where do you measure up? And are you providing your audience with that level of curation that at this point we kind of need? So the fourth trend has to do with curation again, but this time on the reporting side. So I want to show you some really incredible, I think, really incredible tools for journalists, because you can actually use curation for reporting. So this is something you haven't seen on Nuzzle. So this is my page. So if you go to nuzzle.com/webmedia, this is what you see. Now, to be sure, you'll be able to see the stuff that I've shared, which is actually not that interesting. The part that's interesting, that's sneaky, is at the bottom. Can you see where it says news from Amy's friends? Right, so this is an interesting little feature where you can actually go through and see everybody who's influencing me. Now, you can certainly just see what who I'm following on Twitter, and if you're clever, you can sort of figure that out on Facebook. But following doesn't necessarily mean that I'm paying attention to them. So the huge differentiator, I think, is that this tells you a piece of information that nobody else does, which is that you can see who I'm paying attention to, okay? Therefore, you can start to think through your source lists, right? You can start to think through your competitors to learn what's influencing particular people. This is Mark Andreessen's account. Okay? If you want to know before Mark Andreessen, this is kind of something kind of awesome you can do. Maybe you shouldn't do this if you're looking for funding. But you can look back to his latest rant, because these are happening pretty often now. You can timestamp that and then check it against this. And you will be able to see whether or not this is something that he was sort of percolating and thinking about and then decided to write, or if there were a series of tweets that set him off and it was really an organic process, because the way that Andreessen is using Twitter has certainly changed how we're doing long-form publishing in short-form formats, right? So this is kind of like an incredibly sneaky reporting tool, that's out there for the public to use. So it turns out the guy who started Nuzzle is Jonathan Abrams. If that name rings a bell, it's because he started Friendster. Friendster is a service we don't use anymore, and there's certainly been plenty of people who have made fun of it. But let's not forget that he was the first. He was the first to the field, and a lot of the work that he did laid the groundwork for a lot of what we see in social networks today, which is, again, why I think that Nuzzle is so important for us to pay attention to. He's launched 4 companies every time, and he's always been a little early. Every time he launches something, other things get built using a lot of his original strategy and processes. So this is something that's in beta and privately. And one of the things that they're trying to figure out now is, well, how can we incorporate more of Twitter and use that inside of Nuzzle to help people curate news? So this is actually a bunch of journalists who are covering Ferguson, who are now all on this list. So for me, looking through this, the really fascinating thing, there were 2 things. One, what are the different journalists sharing? It's really interesting to see different vantage points between, everybody's on the ground, everybody's covering the same story. This is kind of like giving everybody an exam, like a standard exam, and seeing how everybody does, right? Which is kind of interesting. The other thing is you can see what links they're sharing. So it's an incredibly interesting, and then you can sort of dig deeper and see who's influencing them and who they're following and the like. And this was around Scottish independence. It's a useful thing for reporters to be able to find, curate, and surface information really fast. This is another quick example to show you how algorithmic curation for reporting can work quite well. So I'm going to read you the first graph of the story. Some of you may already know what I'm about to read. A shallow magnitude 4.7 earthquake was reported Monday morning, 5 miles from Westwood, California. According to the US Geological Survey, the tremor occurred at 6:25 a.m. Pacific time at a depth of 5.0 miles. This may not be the most fascinating story you've ever read until you get to the very bottom, which says this information comes from the USGS Earthquake Notification Service, and this post was created by an algorithm written by the author. Okay, so this was a project by Ken at the LA Times. And when this happened months ago, not a ton of people were really talking about it, but those who were first excited and then predicting the end of journalism. Because clearly the robots have taken over, right? The thing that I find so fascinating is that we used to have people do this, right? They were called GAs. They were the ones right out of college who would enter the newsroom, and they would take that information, compile it into a file, and give it to the senior reporter who would do a write-through, or who would incorporate that information into a bigger story. Well, guess what? We don't have those people anymore because, it's expensive to produce news. So this is essentially, replicating that work with a bot, instead of a person. So Ken has posted all of this on GitHub, which I recommend you going to later on. But this became the basis for the reporter's story that actually did get printed in the paper. So what's happening here is the bot is taking care of the basic work and just getting the information out. And then the reporter is coming back and using that information in order to do that bigger story, to do the work that it takes the thought for. So before everybody sort of freaks out, you guys aren't going to freak out, other people freak out when they hear about this. It was updated a whole bunch of times by humans and rewritten, and obviously it was checked. This was meant to be supplemental time-saving work, aided by bots in an incredibly smart way. This was a really, starting out as an experiment, but this is a really, really smart way to think through newsrooms of the future. And it allowed the journalists to do the much more difficult analytic work because this sort of simple part was out of the way. What we're talking about is curating selected content in order to create efficiencies for reporters, for newsrooms. So your key takeaway here, harness curation tools to help enhance, but not to replace, your newsroom's reporting efforts. And there are a whole bunch of them out there for you to start playing with. If you were to just do one thing, my recommendation would be to build a bot. Now you can do this in a bunch of different ways. If anybody's emailed me over the past 6 weeks, you got a response from a bot first. Some of you got 70 responses in a row from that bot, because I totally screwed it up badly. I made a bot that would go through my inbox, which is constantly a disaster, and I had it triaging different messages out to different people, and some of them just went into a permanent wasteland, mostly on purpose. But it sent those responses back and forth, and that was an experiment that I did, over a weekend just to see what might happen. I decided it turned out not to be such a great idea, so I killed it, but I learned a lot about how people interrelate on email and what's acceptable and isn't acceptable. And so I'm not going to use the bot anymore, but the process itself was incredibly rewarding. You can do the same thing. So if not an email bot, maybe don't do this with your work email accounts. Go to GitHub. And Ken's got his code up there. Take it and play with it. And you may not live in an earthquake zone, but a lot of us have public safety information that's now public, so police information, fire information, and see what you might be able to do. All right, the fifth trend is cognitive computing. So here's what I mean by that. Machine learning and artificial intelligence, that field has really sped pretty far ahead. And there's all kinds of theoretical, really interesting work around what happens when the computers are smart enough to think and to make inferences and to start doing some work on our behalf. The challenge with that is that the computers themselves, the hardware, haven't yet had enough processing speed and haven't yet been able to really crunch all of that data in order for it to be meaningful. So the hardware has sort of been transitioning in one way. In the meantime, all this theoretical work has been happening, and we are finally starting to reach a center point where the machines have finally caught up with the power of the code, and we're starting to see some really interesting things happen as a result. The first one that I want to show you is incredibly lightweight, but it's a harbinger of what's to come. So this is an application for your phone called Emu. And this launched out of private beta a couple months ago, so you can now download it and play with it. And this is what it looks like. So this is a sort of a WhatsApp-ish sort of messaging system. And this is my sister and I talking about going to see a movie. So I start off by saying, hey there, are you free Saturday night? Do you want to go see a movie? Okay, it read and inferred that by movie on Saturday night, I meant that I wanted to go to a theater, watch a movie, that I meant this Saturday night, not Saturday 2023 or something. And therefore, it pulled up my calendar on the fly. It pulled up her calendar, looked to see where we were and if we had free time. And it also pulled up all of the movies playing in our area. Okay, so that all happened within a fraction of a second after me hitting send. And she also saw that information. She demanded that we go see Captain America, which I did not want to see. But there was that little play button. There's a preview in that screen. So now, as we're thinking about what we want to see, I can actually watch the preview without leaving the app. It also tells me all of the times that the movie is available and whether or not the movie is sold out in the theater that's closest to us. It gives me the ability, you don't see it here, to click and purchase tickets in advance, to just have that happen without leaving the app. Then I said, well, you want to get dinner at Sullivan's. It immediately knows that I'm talking about Sullivan's Steakhouse because that's the restaurant that's nearby versus Sullivan's, I don't know, shoe factory, something you can eat shoes. I'm very tired. So it pulls up Sullivan's, it pulls up Yelp, it pulls up all of the recommendations and the ratings, and it also gives me the ability to see whether or not there's going to be a table available at a time that makes sense with the movie time that we're looking at. So this is an incredibly powerful, although seemingly innocent, amount of technology that's happening right here on your phone, and it's happening all in real time on the fly. So this is an example of this sort of more advanced cognitive computing that we are starting to see reach the masses. This is one of a few similar types of applications that have launched over the past couple of months. All of them have basically been acquired. So Donna launched very briefly, was out for a heartbeat, and immediately acquired by Yahoo. Q started out as something called Gremlin, pivoted, became Q, quickly acquired by Apple. And there are many more. So we're finally starting to see natural language processing and AI work in conjunction enough with the machines that we have to understand our intentions. So where does this leave us? Well, this just launched last week. This is a new feature of Microsoft Office 365. Has anybody seen this dashboard? Is anybody using this yet? So this thing is just now starting to launch. And it may not look that exciting to you, but if you sort of go through and analyze what's there, I think it does become a much more exciting prospect. So it combines Bing in that there's a search window, and let's say that you're sitting on your home computer and you're working on a story about, I don't know, the Cubs, and you type that in, it will reference everything else in your machine and the email that you have and the people that you've been talking to infer that you're talking about a baseball team, not, that was a horrible example to use, because what else would you use for Cubs? I don't know, bears? You're interested in wildlife. So it's searching the internet, it's searching your C drive, it's searching sort of your personal universe and making inferences about what exactly you want. There's a social component, so you can connect with other people and they can aid you in that productivity. There are tools and apps at the top. There's the Office component as well, so the idea is that you would do a lot of your Office work, Microsoft Office work, inside of this. And now, if you can imagine, right, think of this as a sort of newsroom dashboard that reporters would use, right? So instead of randomly querying, Google for something, you would sort of be querying a personal universe with the option to go somewhere else? Or what about a dashboard for consumers? I was searching for something on ISIS not too long ago on the Times, and I am very concerned about what's happening in the world, but I was really looking for information about the mobile wallet, right, that had to change its name. Anybody looking at my user behavior would know that if I type in ISIS, I mean the other ISIS, right? If you were able to crack that nut for your news consumers, you would never lose them because you would be delivering them the information that they were looking for. So Microsoft's got a few things that it's working on. This is another new suite that literally just launched that allows you to input huge enterprise data sets, keep them private, crunch some numbers, and have really interesting visualizations to help people interpret what those numbers mean. Now, these are sort of more meant at the moment for sales forces, right? So big enterprise companies, but that stuff has a tendency to trickle down into individual use cases. Anybody recognize this logo? Okay, so memorize it, because it's important. This is Watson, okay? IBM as a company has been around for more than 100 years, 100 years. And the thing that we think most, if we associate Watson with IBM at all, is that it's a clever trick that went on Jeopardy and won a cool game, right? Well, it turns out that Watson is much, much more than that. Watson is an incredibly powerful cognitive computing platform. And aside from doing stuff like making real-time recipes at South by and playing games on Jeopardy, it's doing things like inferring our information, our digital behaviors. It has the ability to look at our medical records, right? It has the ability to look at lots of different data sets because we're creating mounds of data every single day and make inferences about us to help others in what they do. You know, you've probably already interacted with part of this platform, right? Has anybody used Many Eyes? A lot of journalists use Many Eyes for part of their reporting. Well, Watson is this bigger ecosystem now, and as part of it, you can upload data, big data sets, and start to make inferences and do different things with them. So the key takeaway here, and this is an important one, is that there are tools that are being used by large corporations now, which you also have access to, that allow you to supercharge your reporting, sprinkle some of the work that you're doing with natural language processing and machine learning and artificial intelligence, and to take hold of the cognitive computing that we're now finally starting to see and which will become a big force starting in 2015. So the question is, how can you start using that in your newsroom? And can you start to build, can you take some cues from what we're starting to see in order to build smarter tools for your consumers? So if you were to try to do just one thing with this information, try one of the new cognitive computing tools. So download Emu, you have to use it with a friend who's also got it. Play around with Watson. Again, it's a big platform, it's a big ecosystem, it's not just sort of a singular thing. Try one of the options out there and think through the implications of it. So the next two trends I'm not going to talk about because we don't have enough time, which I planned for in advance. But everything is available for you to download afterwards. I'll quickly overview what they are. The sixth one has to do with ambient proximity. So that is beacons, which I know there was a session on today, Bluetooth, something called Bluetooth LTE, which means that if you get nearby something, it'll send you information. So there's a whole bunch of details and information on what that is and how journalists can use it in the deck that you can download afterwards. And the seventh trend had to do with virtual reality. How many people have had a chance to use the Oculus or one of its many competitors? That's great, that's really great. I would encourage all of you, the next time that you're at an event, if there is an Oculus there, and if there is a 3-hour wait, bring something to do and wait. Wait because it's important that you have the experience, and anybody who's tried one of these things on, Dan in the back of the room I know is experimenting. If you see him afterwards, you might even invite people up to Syracuse, right? Okay, so hear that. There are 3 rifts in the Midway next door with the journalism story that you can experience, which you created, right? Okay, so that's hardcore. You should go do that. And you should also talk to Dan because he's incredibly smart. So virtual reality for news and for many other things is definitely coming. I explain what all of that is in the deck. You should download it and take a look at it. And don't leave this conference until you've had a chance to try the experiment that Dan's working on with Gannett. All right. The 8th trend is ephemeral content. Suddenly everybody wants content that's going to disappear on them. So Snapchat started out, Snapchat was developed by a former Googler who had deep knowledge of how email works there. And Snapchat was originally a solution to send private content. And, sorry, I just transposed 2 things. Snapchat was not started by a former Googler. Secret is, but we'll also talk about that. So erase that from retweet corrections. So Snapchat started out as a private messaging service. We all know what happened quickly thereafter. And then after that happened, this happened, marketing, right? So Taco Bell has a pretty clever Snapchat account, and it encourages people to send snaps of fiery tacos and other delectables with doodles. And this is all well and good, but if you think about it, content that disappears is kind of an amazing thing because it helps clear up our incredibly cluttered streams, right? I look at my email inbox, which is a disaster, and man, part of me wishes that the content would just self-destruct. If I didn't, bad on me, I didn't interact with it within a certain amount of time, and now it's just gone. I think it's actually kind of an interesting way to deal with an increasing problem that we all have, which is that there's just too much, right? So it disappears. So there's a bunch of these applications that are coming to market, in part because people are incredibly concerned now about privacy. I think in part because it's nice to do away with what's become a sort of mandatory and horrific filing system. So this is Confide, which was started by John Broad, who's a former AOL Ventures guy. And this is not just ephemeral, which is to say that it disappears, but it's also has end-to-end encryption. So this is an email system that works on mobile. And as you type in your message and send it to the person that it's intended for, they literally have to wipe through the redacted words in order to read it, and then it disappears. There's end-to-end encryption, which means that you can still trace. If anybody wanted to, you could really triangulate where that person was, where their phone was when the message got sent. So it doesn't take that part off the grid, but it does scramble the content of the message so it can't be detected later on. I talked to John a lot about it, and I've taken a look at what they've built. And it's not, the content isn't being stored anywhere. So this is sort of an interesting new way to send messages that really do disappear and can't be found later on. And because of how it's configured, unless you've got somebody else taking a photo, which is always the problem, then you can still see what was on the person's screen, but you can't really take a screenshot because of how it's configured. Quick aside, if anybody is concerned about somebody standing over, well, I guess that wouldn't work, because you would need to, never mind, I'll forget that. I was gonna say you could use, I've got this really cool screen protector. You can literally not see anything on my iPad unless you're staring straight at it. But that only works if I want to protect myself from taking a photo of what's on the screen. That doesn't protect somebody else. Anyhow. So there's another one called Kilroy, which allows you to do the same thing, upload photos and messages. They disappear after they've been seen. This one is called Versap, which is kind of interesting. So you can create a social network of your friends, your peers, your family. And once everybody's opted in, you can send them messages that are both anonymous and disappear. So if you've got like 5 roommates and you're feeling passive aggressive, you could send a message saying, hey jackasses, I know it's you, clean the sink or whatever. And you can sort of send that without being the person who left the note. So that's one way that you can use it, and it's anonymous and it disappears. Cluster is another similar situation, so it's another sort of localized private network that you create. It can be friends and family. You send your content, it eventually goes away. Blink was temporarily, it was gone in a blink. Yahoo acquired it, so similar kind of ephemeral content. And Slingshot is one of Facebook's new entries. So this is mobile app only, off-platform, so it's not part of the primary Facebook app. set it up, send content to your friends and family, and nobody else supposedly sees it. They're also launching something called Moments, which you've probably heard about, which is, again, another way to sort of control the content and its potential to get out and be seen by people you don't want to be seen by. So what does all this mean? Well, the research that we've been doing at work leads me to believe that people will start wanting this ephemeral functionality for many different reasons, and that we're going to start not just seeing standalone apps, but I think this is going to be a feature set that gets built in to lots of different existing apps going forward, because we're seeing such demand in the marketplace for it. And that may have some implications for you. For one thing, we're starting to see journalists publish content. So this is Now This News using Snapchat to publish their content, their journalism content, which is an interesting idea, right? But it also potentially has some drawbacks. And so that's your key takeaway. So ephemeral content and ephemeral functionality is definitely a thing for 2015. And it can certainly be used for publishing news, but you're going to have some really meaningful conversations around what's ethical. Because unlike posting a correction, you can delete a tweet, you can delete a Facebook post, but you can sort of still track to see it was there. It's really, really hard to recover this stuff. So if you decide you're going to start using ephemeral networks, it's really hard to take back something that's gone, right? So with that in mind, I do think you should experiment. And my recommendation would be to try using one of these networks as a way to live blog, just to see what happens. And to, again, gauge how your audience is reacting to the content that you're pushing. If you're going to use Snapchat, just bear in mind, even with a stylus, it's really, really hard to write on that screen and make it legible. So keep that in mind before you really start with it, but something to try when you get back. All right, speaking of ephemeral networks and disappearing content, the ninth trend, and probably the biggest and most important one for 2015, has to do with privacy and security. So if you have not already, in 2012, Matt Honan posted an incredible story at Wired about how he got hacked. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. If you haven't, the link has just been tweeted out for you, and he's easy to find online. It's a really, really good step-by-step account of both what happened and then why it happened. So I recommend that you take a look at that. But that was back in 2012. In the 2 years since, we've seen all kinds of privacy-related problems when it comes to our personal digital lives and professional digital lives. We've got phone hacking. We have an incredibly volatile, horrible situation for journalists working in dangerous areas because they can easily be tracked using the social networks and the tools, the digital tools that they now have. iCloud Gate just happened, and a whole bunch of people were surprised, not just that Apple's iCloud was so easily hacked, but because of Apple's response. So this is sort of a good time to start thinking through protecting your digital privacy and also the privacy of the people that you're interacting with. So I want to show you a couple of possibilities and things to think about. So you may have started seeing in people's social media bios their PGP. It'll say like their public key, and then there'll be a whole bunch of numbers afterwards. PGP is pretty good encryption. And basically what this allows you to do is to send encrypted content back and forth. So again, I can still see that something was sent, and I can triangulate using the IP where it was coming and going from, but I can't see the content itself. And if you have, I would give yourself a few hours, because this is not the kind of thing that you can sort of just get up and running. But it does allow you to send confidential information back and forth. And depending on the reporting that your newsroom is doing, or depending on the kind of work that you're doing, this may be of increasing importance to you. So you can Google this and find a lot of different options. MIT has a public key server that'll help you get started as well. There's a lot of resources online. Now this is, for those of you who want an easier solution, there's something called the Black Phone, and this literally just came to market, and they ran out of them as soon as they launched. So Blackphone was started by some very interesting people. They are based in Canada and Switzerland for various reasons. And they're smart people, and they're eager to help journalists, partially because of what they know. So this is what the Blackphone looks like out of the box. And what the Blackphone allows you to do, so there were these two companies, Silent Circle and the Blackphone. Blackphone folks were looking at networks and hardware. Silent Circle is something that you can actually download and use now. And what it does is it scrambles the circuit between you and whoever else is using Silent Circle. So if you want to make a phone call that literally cannot be detected or listened to in any way whatsoever, Silent Circle is something that you can use. It's an app. But if you want to be completely off the grid, if you want nobody to detect you at all, then there is this phone called the Blackphone that will do that. This is what it looks like out of the box. This is me playing with it. I don't have it with me. And basically, this phone will allow you to communicate with people using voice or using email or using messaging completely undetected. Now, you may wonder why. I'm not somebody who wears a tinfoil hat, so why does this matter? And the reason that it matters is because I have a good understanding of how security works now, and at one point, I was a journalist, and my phone was tapped when I lived in China. And it was, not fun being a journalist and being followed and being, looked at, and I wasn't even in a dangerous area. We have journalists, it's a horrible time, safety-wise, to be a journalist in a lot of places. And part of the reason is because the digital tools that we have make it a lot easier to publish information out to the world to make real change. But the flip side of that is it's a lot easier to find you, even if you're using a burner phone, even if you're swapping out your SIM. So the guy who started this, Toby, we had this long conversation about, well, what does that mean for journalists? And he said, journalists just, if they really are concerned, that you just shouldn't use email at all. Even if you've got a Blackphone or something else that, just forget about email. If that's not an option, then use something that's encrypted and try to find a phone. Blackphone is one of them, but there are others out there that allow you to make those connections without being detected. So, a couple of other quick things. I thought The Guardian did something so smart, and they do a lot of smart stuff. But this is something that they've launched that uses encryption, and again, I can still detect where the drop was made because I can triangulate, but I can't see what the drop was. So they've set up basically a whistleblower file sharing program on their site that allows anybody to send files undetected. It'll be detected without the content and the contents being seen and traced back to an individual person. They've basically made it a lot easier to share critical information with the reporters at The Guardian. This is incredibly smart. I really encourage you to go take a look at the work that they've done. And it's the kind of thing I think that a lot of news organizations should try to replicate because it gives you, again, that additional layer of privacy and helps you get to sources that may be unwilling to talk to you otherwise. And just as another quick thing having to do with the sort of hackerspace, so this is a case where benevolent hackers have set up a system and there's like a whole bounty system now for people who are white hat hackers. So a lot of different companies are using their services to poke holes in the security of what they've got, and they can use it and get paid for it. So I just wanted to highlight this to you because I think it's a really interesting piece of this ecosystem. So key takeaway, if you are concerned about your privacy as somebody who works within news, or you're concerned about the safety of your staff, you should start thinking very thoughtfully about how you're using digital tools and what kinds of content you're asking for those folks to send you and that you are sending to them. If you were to just do one thing, if this is something that interests you, I recommend getting yourself a key and experimenting with PGP and playing around with encrypted email. It won't break the current inbox that you have, even if that's what you want to have happen. And it'll give you a greater understanding of this sort of emerging world of encryption, because I can promise you that going into next year, this is going to be an incredibly important piece of our overall digital ecosystem. Finally, I want to have a word with you about church and state. So I've had a lot of conversations lately with journalists about the role that the business people and the editorial people play together, and how that line is becoming more and more blurred. And every time I hear that conversation, I say, well, what about the product people? Because it strikes me that the product people should be part of this conversation, and whose side of the line are they on? One of the questions that I always ask of editorial folks is, do you actually know what your audience behavior is on specific story packages? I don't want to know how many people were there or how much time they spent there. I want to know what their behavior was. And they always say, oh, yeah, we know that. But I don't think most places have actual data that proves out the hypothesis that they've got, that they are making critical strategic decisions on. So, say what you will about BuzzFeed, because we all love to hate on BuzzFeed. But I will tell you this, they're really, really good at tracking their audience. Tracking their audience and looking at their audience behavior is different than posting crazy cat photos in order to get audience. So they also do that, but something that they do really well is that they track audience behavior and they react to it. And they've seen a 244% increase in their weekend traffic as a result of doing this monitoring and mining their own data. Incredibly smart. I also wanted to highlight, this was another really interesting project that was written up incredibly in the Neiman Journalism Lab. But this is the New York Times, and they built this really smart project tracker that endeavored to figure out, at least with the Olympics, why are we having bounce in certain places? Why are people not engaging with stories as they go on? And they built, and it's a very long story, but you should read it because it really maps out and explains the strategy behind looking through data to understand people's behaviors and to understand why they may be leaving or not engaging with additional content on your site. Incredibly smart. Winning the internet isn't rocket science, it's data science. And it's data science that you can employ within your organizations. So the key takeaway here, if you don't know what your organization's data strategy is, and I actually believe that everybody in the organization should be aware of what their data strategy is, then you should find that out. If you don't have one, then you should get one. That would be a good thing. And can you start to allow your data strategy to help inform your editorial strategy, which is not to say that the business folks should take over for the editorial folks, but you should start having some conversations around what's going to inform and engage your users the best in the best possible way. So if you were to just do one thing, you can do your own predictive modeling strategy. I'm going to show you how to do this, and then you can download this later and do it on your own. But basically, the very beginning of this, and anybody in here can do it, would be to download and look at the past 6 months of your traffic and the past 6 months of your social interactions. Again, just as a start, obviously there's way more to it than this, and make some assumptions. The website didn't break, the internet didn't break, stuff like that. Exclude outliers. And then try to learn. Categorize stories read by theme, categorize stories read by device. Do you see any patterns emerging? You can use technology to do this at a higher level, but the best thing that you can do is to just go through the thought process on your own, to start making inferences and to start doing some learning. So we have gotten to the end of the trends. I've got one last thing, and then I will let everybody go. Kara Sinesco and I just launched a business. So we just launched this training business, which is pretty exciting. And I can tell you about that later. But we're female co-founders, so I kind of dig that. I think that's awesome. And I made it through without collapsing on the stage, which is a big personal accomplishment. So thank you. I'm here to answer any questions you want. And if anybody wants to track their brain waves, come and see me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please exit the room. We are going to close the air walls. Please exit the room. Thank you.